What is the real lesson of Memorial Day? And what are the ramifications of President Trump's use of immigration controls to vet foreign students? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine those two questions. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, a show that brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host for the show, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel, longtime libertarian. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
All right, Richard. So we celebrated Memorial Day this week. Memorial Day, of course, is different from Veterans Day. Veterans Day is when we honor anybody who has served in the military. And Memorial Day is to commemorate those who have died in America's, well, foreign wars. I mean, that's really the only wars in our lifetime in which people have died. And certainly for many, many decades, maybe a century or so. And so I thought, well, let's start out with that. There's also some stuff going on with student visas and President Trump restricting the ability of foreigners to come and study the United States. I thought maybe we ought to spend some time talking about that too. But let's start with Memorial Day. I find this memorialization of troops that have died and honoring troops who have died really strange, because it seems to me that you really ought to focus on what they were fighting for before you start honoring them. It just seems kind of strange to honor somebody who, for example, has killed people in a war that his government had no business waging. Now, one could say, well, Jacob, he had to follow orders, though, and once he followed orders, he was there and he behaved heroically and courageously, and he saved some of his fellow men by, smothering a grenade that was going off, something like that. And yet, if we go back to what I think is a classic example of this phenomenon, Nazi Germany, we don't honor German soldiers who were in that war. I mean, you would think that if you're going to honor soldiers who have died, you would think, well, why not honor all soldiers who have died in wars? But it's Memorial Day, I think, is limited only to American soldiers. But I don't see Germany having a Memorial Day for soldiers who died in World War II. And why is that? I mean, the German soldiers, they were courageous, they were heroic, some of them at least. Some of them sacrificed themselves for their fellow soldiers. Why doesn't Germany have a Memorial Day for them, honoring them? And I think the reason is because it's generally accepted that Germany was involved in an evil war, what the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal called a war of aggression. They were the ones that attacked Poland, and so Poland was the defending power. And so but that implies then that people ought to examine the nature of the war that they're talking about before they start honoring the troops that have died there. Well, if you look, for example, at the U.S. invasion of Iraq, there's another classic example of a war of aggression that was condemned at Nuremberg. Iraq never attacked the United States. It never even threatened to do so. The United States was clearly the aggressor in that conflict. For me, it's no different. Their invasion of Iraq was no different from Germany's invasion of Poland, in the sense that they were the invaders, they were the attackers, and they stayed there and they killed a lot of people. And I hold that U.S. soldiers had no right to kill anybody in Iraq because they didn't have a right to be there. They were there illegitimately, and so even in self-defense, when an Iraqi soldier was shooting at him, I don't think they had a right to shoot back and kill that Iraqi. It's like a guy that's owns a home and a burglar comes into his house, and the homeowner fires at the guy, and the guy fires back and kills the homeowner. Can the burglar say, "Oh, I was firing in self-defense"? I don't think so, because he doesn't have a right to be there. And so I don't see how we can honor soldiers for killing people or dying in a war that they shouldn't be there. I think what we really ought to be doing is critically examining why this happened, why the government sent them into this thing, because they ended up really dying for nothing. Same with Vietnam. I mean, they died for nothing. And I think it'd be much more helpful to have a day in which people do soul searching of what this government has done to soldiers, how they've treated soldiers, sacrificing them for nothing, putting them in a position of kill or be killed. Um, for example, Afghanistan, there's never been any soul searching about Afghanistan. They were there for 20 years, killing and dying. And for what? As soon as they lose that conflict, then all of a sudden, coincidentally, there's this big brouhaha over Russia and Ukraine. Well, how convenient is that? Because there was never any real soul searching of what happened in Afghanistan, the lies that went into that war. And it seems to me, Richard, that rather than encouraging soldiers in these areas, thanking soldiers for their service, it'd be much more helpful to confront the wrongful nature of these wars. I mean, look how many veterans commit suicide. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there's a lot of guilt for having killed people wrongfully, from just regular people that have consciences. And yet we never have confronted that. We thank them for their service. Thank you for killing those people over there in Iraq. When I think we would have been better served, and the soldiers would be better served, the veterans would be better served, just coming to grips with the guilt involved with wrongfully killing people and the wrongful nature of these foreign conflicts. What do you think?
Well, I think sometimes the best way to approach a topic that is so delicate and easily likely to uh, make people feel defensive, but it's our country, our soldiers, uh, perhaps their loved ones, that to step aside and look at the same type of conduct in terms of honoring the dead and what they fought for, in looking at it in a different country, a country that uh, we would not feel positive about right now. And that's Russia. It is now 80 years since the end of the Second World War. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. And that's the day when, on May 8th, the Germans surrendered to the Western Allies. On May 9th, the remnants of the German government surrendered on the Eastern Front to the Soviet Army. And what they call in then in the Soviet Union, now Russia, the Great Patriotic War, has become a linchpin of loyalty, identity, and allegiance to the regime. It's a way of indoctrinating people that they should be willing to make sacrifices for their government, as defined and ordered and directed by the government. They had a huge parade in Moscow on May 9th of this year. A huge display of armaments, tanks, missiles, drones, uh, tens of thousands of soldiers parading in front of Vladimir Putin, his governmental entourage, as well as foreign dignitaries such as Xi Jinping, president of China. And what is the whole purpose of this? It's now 80 years. There's virtually no veterans of that war alive anymore. Just a handful of people who are agedly over 100. But why is the importance of arousing this idea of those who have sacrificed, those who have died, those who gave the last final measure? It's because of a way of indoctrinating your population to think that those who died in the past should be emulated, models for you to be willing to die for your country in the future. Now, both the Soviet regime and now Putin's post-Soviet Russian government insists that this was a just war, that the Germans had invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, that they were defending their homeland. And at one level, that's true. But how did that war begin? That war began with Stalin signing a secret pact with Hitler to divide up Poland if a war broke out, and for Stalin to get a whole swath of other territories in Eastern Europe that he swallowed up, including the Baltic republics. And all the documents that were temporarily released in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union from the Russian archives made it a very strong case that the only reason why Hitler invaded the Soviet Union was that he got the jump on Stalin, who was planning his own preemptive attack to invade the Nazi Germany. And people would die in that war on the Soviet side for the Soviet Union, for Comrade Stalin, right? You're dying for the God Commissar. And Putin uses this as a way of saying what the government requires you to sacrifice for, you must sacrifice for. Your country's destiny, its future, its survival is dependent upon it. Now we see all through that, don't we? Does anybody view what Vladimir Putin advocates or does through military aggression right now in Ukraine is justified from a freedom point of view? Certainly libertarians shouldn't consider it so. Regardless of what Ukraine may have done and the NATO countries may have done to create this situation, from a libertarian point of view, there's no defense of Russia invading Ukraine. You'd say another country, that's their own business. You don't start a war. But Putin doesn't view it that way. He wants to arouse the patriotism of the people to risk and, if necessary, give their lives for what the government says they need to do in an armed conflict. Now, while it's hard for Americans to accept this fact, I would argue that at one level it is no different with the way war has been portrayed and those who have died in America's wars, certainly for the last century, certainly including the Second World War. I grew up watching war movies. For the first 15 years after the end of the war, there were all these war movies, the war in the Pacific, the war in Europe. A little kid, I watched all of them on TV, just like most of the rest of the people who were over 50 years old today. That's what you watched as a little kid on TV. What were you supposed to feel? A sense of patriotism. You're defending your country. You'd see people sacrificing or risking their lives. A homage to those who, as you said, threw themselves on a grenade. Why was this the case? Because the government wanted to have a situation in which the people, through public education and through the media, were made to believe that America is right, America is good, America is just, America is worth fighting for, regardless of what a more objective analysis would offer. And that's been the case all during these decades. Now, some of the viewers and listeners may have heard the name Leonard Read, Leonard E. Read. He was the founder, first president of the Foundation for Economic Education. And in the 1950s, he wrote a pamphlet during the Korean War called Conscience on the Battlefield, which was shocking to many because the imagery is that he's in the mind of an American soldier who's been wounded and is dying on the battlefield. And what are his last thoughts? And what are his, as of course, I'm just summarizing and abbreviating. Why am I here? Why have I been put in this situation to have to fight others who've never done anything personally wrong to me? Why am I now lying here about to die in this war with no justification? America was not attacked. America's survival was not threatened. But a government has commanded that I go to foreign shores fighting for a purpose that they've defined having nothing to do with a legitimate sense of national defense against aggression. And I'm the sacrificial lamb on this battlefield whose blood is oozing out and whose life is about to be extinguished. The same premise is through all of these wars, just for our lifetime since the Second World War. Vietnam, that war was started by a trumped up accusation about North Vietnam attacking American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin as an excuse to send over 500,000 soldiers to Vietnam, to kill 1 million Vietnamese, to sacrifice the lives of over 50,000 Americans. Now, that left a bad taste in the mouth of Americans, and it made them wonder about whether it's true America, right or wrong. But as time passed, that realization and bitterness passed away. So that now when America was called upon to defend itself as defined by the government because of the 9/11 attack, which was the justification for the invasion of Afghanistan, and then that as a rationale for wanting to knock down other enemy states on trumped up charges of weapons of mass destruction and the invasion of Iraq. Again, America, you serve your country. You follow the political leadership. They're the ones who know what is necessary and needed for America's survival and defense. And you must be willing to give that last full measure if necessary. And don't worry, you have been educated. You've grown up on the same holidays. You've seen the same movies. You've gone through the same educational process. That way, if you make that final measured sacrifice, you too will be honored. You too will be honored. You will have died for your country. It is the idea that the nation state is somehow an entity that justifies your life to be given up, regardless of the reasonableness and the true justice of the cause. Now, let me say here, my father fought in the Second World War. He served in the Navy in the Pacific. I have here on one of the bookshelves here the little brownie camera snapshots that he took because he was aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay when the Japanese surrendered on September 2nd, the formal surrender, September 2nd, 1945, when Douglas MacArthur accepted the surrender from them. Yeah, I have his little snapshots. They're moments of history on my little bookshelf here, okay? But think of all the people that died in that war. Think of all the people that died after that war. And we have to ask ourselves, don't we need to ask, evaluate, decide, objectively think about, was the war really justified in the sense of defending the life and the territory of the United States? Or did it serve other political motives, maybe well-intentioned, maybe really believed in, but other political motives of those in political authority in Washington, D.C., who decided that the America must reach out beyond its own borders and to serve purposes that the politicians decide that placed so many Americans in harm's way and not only left so many dead, but so many permanently harmed, either mentally or physically. And that is the legacy of the war.
Yeah, well, you brought up a lot of good points. When you were talking about Leonard Read, I remember that essay, Conscience on the Battlefield. And if you've never read it, those of you that are watching this program, highly recommend it. It is so moving. And I remember when I was working there at FEE, I was going through Read's journals, and there were people who were advising him not to publish this essay. You're going to lose donations, Leonard, because, conservatives don't like hearing that kind of thing. And Leonard said, publish it. And regardless of what donors say, and that's one of the reasons Reed has always served as such an inspiration for me, is that he that was a great essay, and people were saying, "Oh, you're trying to blame the individual soldier," and Reed said, "No, that what I'm trying to do is make people realize that the individual soldier is responsible for his own actions. That he joins the military knowing that they're going to be using him in this purpose, and so he's having this exchange with his conscience on the battlefield as he's dying. It's a very powerful indictment of what the government does. It treats people like pawns, but as you point out, they need the support of the citizenry in this. They need to glorify it. They need to honor it, that they have died for their country. They have died heroically. We need to honor them. Don't ever question what they were dying for. You can't do that. We're not going to tolerate that. But we just want you to honor them because we're going to keep doing it over and over and over again, which of course they have. From Vietnam, they go to the Persian Gulf War, to the uh, Iraq, Afghanistan. I mean, it's just on and on. You're I couldn't help but smile when you were talking about the parade in the Soviet Union because President Trump is organizing a military parade just like they did. I mean, it's like we're copying Putin and the Russians with this military parade. And the Republicans said, "Oh, we're going to cut spending. We're going to cut spending." They haven't cut anything, Richard. I mean, they may have made government more efficient, downsized it here at this agency or that agency, but overall, government spending is continuing to soar through the roof. They're spending a lot more than what they're bringing in. And now they're going to spend, I don't know, millions of dollars on this military parade with tanks and equipment and troops going down the streets of Washington, D.C. I think it's a horrible image of a militarized nation, especially when they're over there militarizing the southern border. Uh, so let's unless you have anything to add on this, let's move on to this visa dispute. It's this whole thing is fascinating to me, like Trump's attack on Harvard, that he's now saying that he's ramping up the stakes on his fight against Harvard by saying that he's going to prohibit them from bringing in foreign students. And from what I understand, like that's a 25% of or a third of Harvard's income, these foreign students. And this is just a custom of American universities and colleges to let in foreign students to come over here and study. It's something that you would think we would want, that they learn our values and then they take them back to their countries. And you and I have talked about this situation with Harvard. It's difficult to feel sympathy for Harvard because they're on the dole. Every university, or practically every university, is on the government dole. And so what Trump is saying is, well, you're on the government dole, you're going to do as I tell you. And Harvard says, no, we want the dole, but we want independence. We want to run our operations. Well, if you want to be independent, you want to run your operations the way you want, get off the dole. Just stop taking government money. But by the same token, Trump isn't this paragon of libertarianism where he's saying, I hold a principled position against funding of universities. No, he believes in this system. He just wants them to do what he wants them to do. And in the process, as he's attacking Harvard, he's now ramped up the stakes by saying, well, you're not going to be able to access our immigration system that vet students. And so here we are now using the immigration control system, which was supposed to protect us from the invaders and the rapists and the murderers and the criminals, now being used against students. The whole thing is perverse, Richard, just absolutely perverse. I mean, you almost get the sense that the Trump isn't just anti-illegal immigrant, that he's really against immigrants in general, at least those that come from certain countries that he doesn't like. It's really a bizarre experience that we're going through where he's using immigration controls in this manner.
Well, I think that the Harvard situation points out the importance, which is sort of a theme you were alluding to, that if we want education to be an open-minded process, to have the ability for dissent, criticism, new ideas, challenged ideas, the only way you can assure that from it coming under attack from one point of view or another is the separation of education from the state. Now, does that mean that Harvard would not be able to get so much money each year because the government dole would be eliminated? Yes. Obviously, there are a lot of faculty members across the campus who live off hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' money. Now, I have no sympathy for Harvard at one level. They have used all this money, either directly or indirectly for the government, to undertake a curriculum that I view as merely just a hodgepodge of watered over Marxian ideas. Instead of a class conflict, it's race conflict, it's gender conflict. The capitalism is the oppressor. The workers and the oppressed people have to rise up. Everything wrong in the world is due to the profit motive. Every capitalist is a woman-hating racist. And they have used this government money and the prestige of their own institution to undertake indoctrination that I considered under dangerous to the true understanding of an America based upon individual liberty, the dignity of the individual, viewing people as individuals rather than tribal entities based upon race and gender. But if Harvard wanted to do this with their own money, that is their own business. The problem here is that Trump hates this stuff, or at least at one level, he says he hates this stuff. But he doesn't want to separate education from the state, as was very clear. And the reason why Harvard got so upset, he wants to have a vetting process and a veto power on who gets hired as faculty, what the curriculum is to be, how students are to be selected, and the way they're going to be taught. In other words, he just wants to do in a different way what Harvard has been doing with their woke and identity politics curriculum. He just wants a different curriculum. In other words, it's just another way of imposing through government dollars on using a method of indoctrination of people for one set of ideas or another. The only way to end this successfully for those who are critical of identity politics and wokeness and those who defend these things is a separation of education from the state. Then the market test would be there. What do parents and the students themselves want as an education? Do they think that this type of identity politics and wokeness is a legitimate basis of how we should think about each other and the way curricula should be structured? Or it is anathema to many Americans, and they would send their children or themselves to other institutions, not bound to such an ideology. But it would also enable a diversity, to use that phrase, of curricula. Trump wants to make every university have the same curricula, the same way these wokey people have been trying to intimidate institutions of higher learning to have only one directive of curricula. Here you'd have the competition of the marketplace, a true diversity of different approaches, maybe perhaps at different schools, and the market would be the test. Is it what you want? Do you think that's what education is about? Is it the type of pedagogical method that is useful in one way or another? And what is its purpose? Is it educating and preparing young people, not just to have open minds, to think, but to be ready to have a profession, a career, an occupation, a stepping stone to the rest of your life? And what is the best way to do this? But instead, we have two competing monopolistic ideologies, the wokey ideology and the anti-wokey Trump version of an ideology. But both want to control the institutions of higher learning to control the minds of Americans, rather than letting Americans control their own minds and sort this out themselves.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that really is the solution. And we can point to Hillsdale College as an example that you don't take government funds and you get to run your affairs the way you want. But I want to add on top of that, though, this problem of control over immigration. Because in a real free society, universities should be free to take whatever students they want from anywhere in the world without going to the government. What business does the government have deciding which students are going to go to Harvard or any other university or any other college? I mean, it's ridiculous. What qualifications does the federal government have determining who are the good students and who aren't the good students? But because of this system of immigration controls, you let the camel into the tent, and all of a sudden, man, it's like, okay, well, I can now control who comes into your university. I'm going to vet them. I want to make sure they're pro-America. I want to make sure they don't criticize the Israeli government. I want this and I want that. So, in other words, the federal government, under the guise of immigration controls, becomes the admission office for universities all across the country. And therefore, the only real solution to this is not only the separation of school and state, but also open borders, the free movements of goods, services, and people across borders. I mean, it shows you the integration of two forms of statism: government control over education and government control over the free movements of people across borders.
Yeah, we have to keep in mind that, there's always slippery slopes. And people often get carried away. They think that every slope is slippery, but there are slippery slopes. And if today the government wants to have the authority to vet the political and social views of those who want to come to the United States to study at our universities and colleges from abroad, the same logical step could be say, well, what about the Americans who want to get accepted at different institutions of higher learning? What are their social media views? Are they pro-Israeli, anti-Israeli? Are they pro-American or anti-American? Of course, pro and anti-American is defined by the president. And of course, that itself depends upon who's the president at the time, but in this case, Donald Trump. And that we could easily see a way of controlling the mindset and the accessibility to education for, God, by golly, native-born citizen Americans, as well as those who just want to come here, perhaps for a few years, to acquire an education. And not everybody who comes here wants to stay in America. Many students study in the United States and then go back to their home countries. But the point that you made is very important. Their countries usually have had traditionally a much narrower conception of personal freedom, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. And they come to the United States, and in comparison to those countries, there's a greater diversity and openness, particularly under the traditional First Amendment. And they learn it's okay to argue. It's okay to hold views separate and disagreeing from what your government says. That why shouldn't it be right to a person be able to speak their mind, whether others like it or approve of it, and let reason and argument sort out what seems right and just and good for people rather than dictated by the state through some official party line. Now, Trump wants to do away with that as government policy. And this is a dangerous precedent because even if you're pro-Trump, even if you hate, the things that are often taught on in the curriculum of institutions of higher learning, or the way they choose to select students by the numbers of race or gender, you can't be sure that another president won't be in power, and that the next president could be another Joe Biden or a Kamala Harris or a whole variety of them, of Barack Obamas, who will then have had the precedent of the government doing this in the vetting of other students. Keep conservative students out. Keep those who do not conform to the left of center president's view of race and gender. Once you set that precedent, then you can't be sure who's going to hold the power over it. As it's sometimes said, the sword has two edges, two blades. And you can never be sure that the blade that comes down is the one that you want to come down rather than the other one that affects you. The only solution, again, is to get government out of education, both in the selection process of students, what is taught on campuses, and how it is taught, and to get the government out of the business of determining who may come to the United States to live here, to work here, to become educated here, or just to come for a visit, and he may or not decide to stay longer or not. But this is represented by Politico reported this, and now other papers have caught on to this, that a memo has been sent to American embassies around the world that the consul departments are now for the moment, put an abeyance on accepting any further applications of foreign students who want to study in the United States until there is a new benchmark standard by which not only would students be vetted, well, are you a criminal in your own country and you just want to come here to escape your own government's law? No, they want to go over your social media, your phone, and decide, have you ever held an idea, a thought, a belief that's contrary to what Donald Trump thinks is American and good for the country? This is dangerous because what will happen to foreigners can someday happen to Americans themselves.
All right. On that insightful note, we'll wrap things up. We're out of time. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Thank you again for your great support of FFF. And Richard, I greatly enjoyed the conversation as always, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.